All right, we'll get right to the agenda then. Mr. Bellamy, welcome to committee. You'd introduce yourself and your back up there. Looks like you've got plenty of people that can answer questions for you, huh?
Mr. Chairman, I'm back up.
Good. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Steve Bellamy, Bureau Chief of Audits and Investigations for the Department of Health and Welfare. And I thank you for inviting me back to provide you more information about the School-Based Services Special Study. Is that the PowerPoint or the PDF? That's the PowerPoint. This morning with me is Dave Taylor, Deputy Director, Department of Health and Welfare. Lori Stiles is the Supervisor of the Medicaid Program Integrity Unit. And we have our newest member, Patty Latte, sitting in the gallery of the Medicaid Program Integrity Unit, and we decided to scare her first day. So here she is. I'd like to review with you the purpose of the school-based service study, the results of the study, and the future of the study, overview of the communication of our efforts throughout this study, and also a review of other school audits that we've done, and then stand for questions.
If you'd speak right into the mic, we'd appreciate it. We seem to have a pretty noisy fan overhead, so thank you.
There were several things that caused us to start the school-based service study. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services had begun discussing their concerns with us and planned to conduct a federal audit. Claims were rising at an alarming rate, complaints were beginning to increase, and prior school district audits had identified questionable billings. The Region 10 auditor for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services had noticed the same trend and began looking at some claim data. The regional auditor informed us that he was going to put school-based services on his audit plan for the next year. We were not alone. Other states were experiencing significant findings resulting from federal audits of school-based services. Fortunately for Idaho, with the timing of the department's own concern and early efforts, the Region 10 auditor agreed to postpone the federal review and allow us to conduct our own study. Given the scope of the problem, we knew then the possible financial risk to the state could have been in the millions. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services continues to target school-based services. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services continues to I'm sorry, I just repeated that. In state fiscal year 2009, the department had seen school-based services increase an average of 36% each year for the prior 5 years. Total claims went from 7.1 million in 2004 to 31.9 million in 2009. The increase continued into 2010, reaching 35.2 million while we developed and implemented a study plan. Between 2006 and 2009, we had started looking at 5 school districts. In those audits, we looked at 13% of the students receiving services and found that 90% of the student files had billing problems. Of the 962,000 in reviewed claims, 124,000 or 13% was found to be overpayments. With the federal concern, other states' losses, rapid increase in school-based services claims, and the problems we identified in these audits, we believed that a special study was the best course of action. In August of 2009, the Program Integrity Unit and the Division of Medicaid agreed on a scope of study. In October, the Integrity Unit met with the program staff to discuss specific concerns. In November, the Integrity Unit submitted a proposal to the state Medicaid program recommending a review of the school districts. We identified several school districts based on high utilization and complaints received by the department. Our plan was to select a small number of students for each district and then to review about 6 months of claims for each student selected. This plan was endorsed by the Medicaid Division and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Prior to the study, the Integrity Unit had started 5 prior audits, as I mentioned earlier. As of today, 26 audits have been completed. An additional 26 audits have been completed. 1 self-study was reported, and 1 is still pending. 2 more audits are in progress by the department's recovery audit contractor, and I'll speak a little more of that later. In the 31 school districts audited, 3,812 students were receiving services paid by Medicaid. We audited 471 students' records, or 12%. Of the student records audited, 358, or 76%, had overbillings. Of the student records audited, there were approximately 41,000 services billed for $3.6 million. As you can see, 23% of the services billed, or 17% of the amount billed, was ultimately identified as an overpayment. Individual school district error rates ranged from no errors to 96%. There were a lot of different types of errors that we found, and I won't read them off, but they are included in the 2 slides for your review, and I'll give you just a moment to scan through those. Probably the most startling to us has been the impact of the study and the impact of the study has had on billings. The chart shows in red how much would have been paid if if the trend for 2004 through 2010 had continued. The difference for the last 3 years might be described as cost savings for a total of $34.4 million. Currently, the department has 1 audit to complete. Our recovery audit contractor will continue a school-based services study consisting of a review of about 1/2 of all the school districts. The department recovery audit contractor has agreed to complete the school district special study. Under our agreement, the recovery audit contractor receives 10% of all overpayments collected. The remaining 90% will be distributed proportionally back to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the school districts. In this way, future school audits will be paid for by federal program and local school districts. The audits will continue using a limited sample size and a limited time frame. There were some concerns voiced in the last visit about penalties, so I'm sharing with you our plan regarding the use of these penalties. This current school-based service study will operate without imposing a penalty. However, there may be some exceptions. We may assess a penalty on any audit if the findings meet the criteria established in Idaho Code Section 56209H, Paragraph 6 of the Idaho Code. We must apply penalties consistently for all providers, including school districts, when we do claim reviews that span multiple providers types, such as the special studies, the speech therapy study. And I'll review that in a moment. We may assess a penalty if we return to a school district and find corrective actions have not been implemented. Finally, I want to give you an overview of the communication and education efforts we have made. It has been our intention all along to do what we can to provide feedback to school districts that there is a problem and it needs to be fixed. Early in the process, we discussed the special study with the school-based Medicaid committee and gave a presentation to the Special Education Directors Conference. We followed that up with a presentation to the Idaho Association of School Business Officials. And as you can see, we also have, in this last year, had 3 occasions to give separate presentations. In addition to that, we published 2 articles in the monthly Medicaid newsletter about school-based services. We've held multiple meetings or discussions with the State Department of Education and Medicaid staff. We continue to update the school-based Medicaid committee on the study status, and we spend significant time with each school district explaining the findings and recommending that they implement a quality review process. We will continue to take advantage of any communication opportunity we can. Some school districts have been audited for other reasons besides the school-based study. The most common reasons were because they were identified in other special studies, which focus on a particular service over all provider types. We have also audited schools based on complaints and audited one district after finding a common employee from another provider who was unqualified. For example, one special study identified school districts among other providers who were billing speech evaluations multiple times. In other studies, a school district was identified among other providers billing interpretive services when Medicaid-covered services were not provided. An interpreter can only be paid by Medicaid when an interpreter is needed to provide Medicaid-covered services and cannot be used for education. In several cases, we received complaints about improper billing practices from varying sources, such as clients, Attorney General Office, and the Department's Medicaid Division. In two separate incidents in the same school district, the use of unqualified staff without proper credentials was found during an audit of another provider. A review of claims showed the same unqualified staff was providing services in that school district. In closing, I would like to restate that the Department's Medicaid Program Integrity Unit became aware of the billing problem that represented a significant financial risk for the state. We engaged and continue to engage in with a variety of people in both Medicaid and education while conducting our study, and we are providing feedback as audits progress. While we acknowledge our work may not be popular with some, we believe that it is a necessary step in order to protect the state of Idaho from a far more reaching and costly federal audit. It is our hope that this study results in increased compliance with Idaho state Medicaid standards. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, that concludes my presentation, and I stand for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Bellamy. Questions?
Mr.
Representative
Chairman.
Tibbetts. Senator Tibbetts, excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bellamy, I'm going to confess I don't know much about this program. So could you give me a summary of school-based services that we're talking about now? You've already talked a little bit about speech therapy and interpretive services being appropriate at times. Can you give me a summary of the other types of services that we're talking about?
Mr. Bellamy.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Tibbetts, I'll give you a short list, and then I probably will, if you want a longer list, we can get a more exhaustive one to you in writing, or I can defer to the unit supervisor, who probably will have a better recollection of all the service types. As mentioned, there are speech therapy, and there is also interpretive services that go along with that. There is also a range of mental health services, psychosocial rehabilitation services that go along with that area, and those are the most common that we find. Lori, did I miss any significant ones? Two other categories: nursing services and personal care services. And those that are medically based, they are in an educational environment, but they're primarily medically based.
Further questions? Representative Luker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Bellamy, could you refresh your testimony there about the payment of the cost of the recovery contractor, how that's being covered?
Mr. Bellamy.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Luker, essentially, the Affordable Care Act required the state of Idaho to contract with someone to come in independently and do contracts. In order to cover half of the school districts, we don't have the resources. It took us 4 years roughly to do the 20-some that we did, the 31 schools that we looked at. So we thought that would be a nice fit with a recovery contractor, that they could come in and do that part of the audit work in Medicaid. The way the reimbursement works under the Affordable Care Act is that the recovery auditor receives 10% of everything that is recovered, not identified, but recovered. So whatever comes in is recovered by the state. 10% of that is paid to the contractor. Then, based on the federal funding rate, for example, 70%, 30%, the balance then is refunded 70% back to the federal partners, and the 30% then would go back to the school district.
And follow-up.
Follow-up, go ahead.
And Mr. Bellamy, so is that 10% sufficient to cover the contractor costs, and is that something that's allowed within the federal system to take that 10% off the top to do that?
Mr. Bellamy?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Luker, yes, not only allowed, it was required. The maximum rate was 12%, and so it's authorized under the federal program, and we're authorized in the state statutes to do the same. And the bid came in at 10%. I can't answer your first question because I'm not sure. They really just started their first review, have their very first preliminary findings report out.
Okay, and follow-up.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Bellamy, is there a projection of how long it's going to take to do the audits for the half of the school districts?
Mr. Bellamy?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Luker, we've asked them to be done within 2 years.
Okay. And one follow-up.
One more? Go
Totally
ahead.
different question.
No, that's all right, go ahead.
And Mr. Bellamy, you may not have an answer to this. It's more of a broader policy issue. It's not, you're doing your job to recover funds that are being misused. On the flip side, school districts are struggling to cover what I think are mandated expenses. And in your investigation, have you got any sense of from the school districts any of the struggle that they're having trying to cover costs that may be mandated for them? And I'm just trying to look for things that you might have uncovered, not that you're responsible for necessarily.
Mr. Bellamy?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Luker, I think really the only part I can speak to is how the Medicaid program is used within the educational environment. And I hope I made it clear there were some significant problems. The biggest risk for us really is not what we're doing, it's the federal program. If they were to come in and do some reviews, I'm pretty sure that what they would find would be pretty significant. We're not alone. A lot of states are going through the same thing as the slide showed. So it's not so much what the impact now is on the school resources. It's really what we're trying to avoid. In terms of other resource constraints, oh my gosh, yes, we are so aware of that. By taking the school study and excluding the penalties, the department gets really no effective reimbursement of costs. We don't even get our state federal share back. That goes back to the school district. So we really are doing this with no means to recover our cost. So I think we've done what we can to have the smallest financial impact and improve the situation.
Senator Cameron?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to go to the penalty portion because I'm kind of like Representative Luker. I certainly understand the need for the audit and may even understand the need for the penalty if you've got someone who's egregious. But as I read the statute, it has language in there that, the district knowingly submits a claim, submits a fraudulent claim, knowingly makes a false statement, those types of entities. So I want to first clarify what I saw and then what I heard you say. We've obviously collected penalties on school districts in the past. Can you tell us how many districts we've collected penalties? And then could you clarify your statement where you said we're not collecting penalties? Is that for the future? Help me understand exactly where the department is at in assessing these penalties.
Mr. Chair,
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cameron, Let me go over this way and explain the difference. If we're doing audits based on a complaint, where we initiate the audit, a client reports an abuse. If we are doing a broad scope audit, like speech services, which are provided in a variety of different different providers, we are using the penalties. The area where we're avoiding the use of the penalties is in this special study, and I described that at the beginning of the presentation, is really a very broad-based look at a lot of schools, and we're looking at a sample of student records. We're using that primarily to get an assessment, or for each school district to get a feedback on how well they're documenting their services and how accurate they're billing Medicaid. On those special studies, we are not assessing a penalty. So if we look at all the audits we've done with all school districts, yes, we have some that we have assessed a penalty. But for this special study, we are not. We have, I think, about 13 school districts. Thanks.
So, Mr. Chairman, while he's looking there, then can you reconcile that statement with slide number 23, which says you have 33,000, I think that's in thousands, dollars worth of penalties under 13 special studies? So
Mr. Bellamy?
Mr.
the words
Chairman.
don't match with what your slide's saying.
Yeah, there's different kinds of special studies. The school-based service, the school-based study, like I said, is just to go into a school, take a random sample of cases, and evaluate them. The other special studies, we do special studies a lot. We look at service categories, services that are provided among all providers, and we look for trends. The speech therapy is the one. Probably the best example, and it's by far the largest amount here, accounts for all of them except for one school district in the special studies. Essentially, we looked at that as a category, as a type of service, because it was growing very, very fast. In that particular case, a lot of providers were billing multiple times for one speech evaluation. It just was occurring. So when we go back and assess penalty for all providers, we also included the school districts in that as well. So that's a different kind of a study.
Follow up? Okay. Representative Wood?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bellamy, I thought I heard you say that when an audit is done and overbilling is found, or whatever other service that is not eligible, that the RAC contractor receives 10%, and that 10% off of the top goes to the RAC contractor. Then the rest is divided between the federal government and the state. I presume that 70% of the remaining 90% that goes to the federal government would go to the federal treasury. And I thought I heard you say that the 30% goes back to the school districts?
Mr. Bellamy?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Wood, yes, you are correct. So the state does not keep any portion of the school-based recoveries.
So,
Follow up,
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
So what I'm hearing you say, maybe my logic is wrong here, but if a school district overbills, they get to keep the 30%?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Wood, yes. They have to reimburse the federal portion, so it's very painful still.
Thank you.
Senator Getty?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bellamy, you listed about 4 states that you said the feds had done some work on. Are those the only states in the nation that the federal government has done the audits on?
Mr. Bellamy?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Getty, there are most certainly more. That was just a few that we pulled.
Mr. Chairman, follow up.
Go ahead.
Mr. Bellamy, do the contractors get to collect a percentage of the penalties assessed as well?
Mr.
Bellamy?
Chairman, Representative Senator Getty, no. The state keeps those.
Mr. Chairman,
Follow up. Go ahead.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bellamy, are there, I assume that providers in addition to school districts are assessed penalties. Is that correct? And can you tell me what percentage of the penalties go to districts versus providers?
Mr. Bellamy.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Getty, that I would not have to go back and pull those figures together.
Follow up.
Yes, go ahead.
Mr. Bellamy, I'd like that. And then my final question would be, you indicated people make claims. Can you tell me who makes claims?
Mr. Bellamy.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Getty, maybe you're referring to the complaints that I was referring
Complaints.
to? Okay. We have a hotline, and the Attorney General has a hotline. So we get calls pretty regularly. We also do service verifications. When a billing goes out, occasionally we will send out a confirmation to determine if that goes to the client or the recipient. And we occasionally get complaints that the one that comes to mind was a child receiving and billed for individual services but were in group therapy.
Mr. Chairman,
One more follow-up?
this begs one more. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Are the complaints coming from competitors that are providing services? Or are they coming from regular citizens or who?
Mr. Bellamy.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Getty, all of them. We do occasionally get providers who want to complain about another provider. I have to be honest, they often don't carry a whole lot of merit. Sometimes they do. It really depends on the nature of the complaint. But I would guess that most of them don't come from providers. They would come from clients, the Attorney General's hotline, or ours.
Senator Vick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Wood asked my question that I was going to ask, but I do have a follow-up on that.
Go ahead.
And that is, doesn't that, if they get to keep that portion, doesn't that kind of give them an incentive to overbill?
Mr. Bellamy.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Vick, they paid it to begin with. So the school districts pay 100%, and then are reimbursed. So when we collect it, we're just giving it back to them. It's their money to begin with. They pay the 30% when the claim. In other words, they pay the match. The school district does. And I have my
Mr.
boss
Taylor,
here
do you
wants
have
to make a
something
comment.
you'd like to add?
I do, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Excuse me. I think one thing that's different about the school-based services in relationship to the other benefits paid out of Medicaid trustee and benefit, the general fund portion does not come out of the Medicaid TMB account or the Medicaid trustee and benefit appropriation we receive. What happens is school districts go ahead and provide to the department the matching required in order to draw down the federal funds. It goes to a trust fund assigned to that particular school district. When we receive a bill from the school district to reimburse them, we make sure that they have enough general funds in order to draw down the federal funds for match. If they don't, we'll give them a call, say we have this bill to pay to you, but we need to have you, contribute those funds to us. Once they do, then the full amount. For example, if a school district bills us for $10,000 in Medicaid billings, then 30% of it would come out of their trust fund, 10% would be used, then it would be used to draw down the remaining 70% from the federal account. Now, back to Representative Wood's question as far as how the penalty works. Same $10,000, let's say our revenue audit contractor went in there and reviewed the account and found that $10,000 was overbilled. They would collect 10% or $1,000. Then what would happen, the remaining $9,000, 70% of that, or $6,300, would be sent back to the federal treasury, and the remaining dollar amount would be put back in the school-based trust account to be used in future drawdowns of federal funds against future claims for the program. And so I just wanted to clarify on that aspect of it.
All right, that helps. Thank you.
Okay. Senator Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this is, Mr. Bellamy, this is a question about the actual billing of the services. So my understanding, having billed Medicaid in the past, is that the school district would contract with a provider for the services that are being provided. It's not, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it wouldn't be a direct employment of the provider by the school district. So therefore, who is actually submitting the bill to Medicaid? Is it the provider or is it the school district?
Mr. Bellamy?
Mr. Chairman and Senator Schmidt, in most of the Medicaid billing arrangements, the liability still stays with the district. The biller is just the intermediary. They collect the information, submit the claim, and handle the reimbursements or handle the funds. But they don't normally take on the liability of the accuracy of the claim. So the school district is the official liable biller, the actual provider.
Thank you.
Further questions for Mr. Bellamy? Or for Mr. Taylor or anyone else up front here? Seeing none, thank you. We appreciate you coming. Some good information. Okay, we're a little bit ahead of schedule, but Senator Lodge, come up. Welcome. Some of my fellow Canyon County delegates had a trying commute this morning, I think. I took the back road, so I missed it. But we welcome you to the committee. Okay, we'll move on. Kendall Mason. I don't. Welcome, Mr. Mason. I understand you have some information for us on the same subject we were just talking about.
Yes, Chairman. Can I have a moment to?
Go right ahead. Whenever you're ready. Take your time, though. We're a little ahead, so not in a big hurry.
Well, thank you very much. I have to say I'm a little bit uncomfortable. I usually don't work in this realm, so excuse me if I step outside of the bounds. I do have a couple of handouts, and I'm not sure how that do I.
Give them to Sharmi, or she take care of that. Mr. Mason, if
for a minute. Yes,
you'd
sir.
introduce yourself and tell us what you do for a living and
Excellent.
why you were nominated to come to do this.
I will do that, Chairman.
Lost the flip, one or the other.
Can you just stay here for a second? Well, my name's Kendall Mason. I'm a special education director in the Jerome School District. I was asked to also share that I was the Special Education Director of the Year last year, voted by my colleagues, and that's the flip I lost. With that distinction, I was also chosen to come talk and not only represent the Jerome School District, but other school districts around the state. I tend to be a very vocal and active director. So I have a lot of director ties across the state from the north to the southeast. And so that's why I was chosen to come here today. As to why I'm here is to talk about a school district's perspective to the Medicaid audit. We went through one of the first audits, and it was a surprise to directors as we went.
Those, excuse me, Mr. Mason.
Sorry,
Did you
Mr.
want those handouts passed out now, or what? Our secretary needs to go back to her.
Okay, sorry, Mr. Chairman. Go ahead and take those. Thank you. Sorry.
That's okay.
And so before we get started, though, I would like to thank you, committee, for inviting us here as schools to be here. This is the first time in my 8-year career as a director I've actually heard that and been invited to something like this. I'd also like to thank the State Department of Education and Health and Welfare. Shannon Dunstan specifically from the State Department of Education and Health and Welfare have really been collaborating and working together to provide training for school districts. So I would like to acknowledge that since we went through the audit, there's actually been a united effort to bring training to the school districts on how to bill school-based Medicaid. So that's very appreciative, and we all hope that that continues. So what I handed out was kind of the typical process for schools to bill Medicaid in Idaho. The bolded sheet, or the bolded words, are all forms that come with the process. And I think that's very important in this discussion, because the forms and the paperwork becomes immense. As a special education director, I have to work through the Individual with Disabilities Act, and that comes with a lot of paperwork itself, and that also ties into Medicaid. So there's a lot of paperwork that teachers at the ground level have to do in order for us to bill Medicaid. And I think it's important to know that these things are being done by teachers. They're completing these forms. There's teams with the principals completing those forms. These are not people that are real familiar with the Medicaid world, I would call it. These are your special education teachers that are out there filling out all these forms. The other handout that I brought, I didn't want to make all the copies. When you put all those forms together, if we were going to bill personal care, it'd be about this thick. And so I didn't make copies for everybody. If we were going to bill behavioral intervention, the forms, and these are just blank forms, right? We haven't even completed them. This will almost double or triple as they start typing in fields on the forms. And so part of our issue with schools and with the Medicaid audit in our case was the amount of paperwork that comes with it and who's doing that. We're asking our classroom teachers to work with kids, and then on the other hand, you need to complete all this paperwork. So that's one of the first things that's shocking for us in schools is the amount of paperwork that comes with that process. And the lack of training. As I mentioned at the beginning, Health and Welfare is really collaborative with the State Department of Education this last year to provide training. In the past, I had been a director for 6 years, 5 years before I'd ever been audited, and I received zero training in school-based Medicaid and how that works. And the constant changes. Recently, we lost intentional behavior intervention, and we gained a new service. And when we get audited on a few years ago, and the requirements have changed. And we don't even remember what those requirements were, because now we're dealing with new Medicaid rule. And so it's very confusing when we went through the audit, because we didn't even remember what some of those qualifications were. You can't go to the website and get them because they're old law. And so that was difficult. And the other thing that's difficult in schools with Medicaid billing is we're dynamic. We're not like a doctor. When you go to the doctor, you sit down, he checks a box, and he says, this is the service I provided. Personal care, a student may need diapering. Well, he may not need it one day, and then he needs it 3 times the next day. So then in the realm of teaching, the teacher now has to not only perform the changing, but then has to log that on a Medicaid sheet and keep track of the time kept, or for any of the services. So it becomes hard in the fact that, the staff's working, and then they also have to track that Medicaid service. So we're not like going to a counselor. You go see a counselor, a psychosocial rehab counselor outside of school, you meet with him for an hour, they check the box, it's an hour. In the school, you may need that service 3 hours one day, 15 minutes the next, 20 minutes the next day. And so that we're dynamic in that the services vary back and forth. We're not real constant on that. And to be honest, the the auditors, they really don't understand special education law. And in defense of them, we don't understand Medicaid. And so there was kind of a clash between us. And there continues to be, because I'm not really all knowledgeable about Medicaid. And this is, I thought I'd just walk through the process of what the audit looked like to us. We got an initial letter June 24th. In my district, it's not a big enough district that I work full-time, so I was not on contract at that time. It was just happened to be lucky that a secretary noticed it was a registered letter, and so that was important. She ran up, made all these copies for Medicaid. It came to 2 boxes, one big paper box and one about an envelope-sized box. So that's the amount of information we sent in initially to Medicaid. September 30th, we got a letter. Of course, by then I've come back, I'm on contract, and I open up the letter. It had 288 lines and a 16-page spreadsheet for us to go through that Medicaid was asking, what's the issue with these services? It amounted to about $56,000. Well, I about fell out of my chair because we'd never been through an audit. Schools hadn't heard much about what it was, how it worked. And, to be honest, if I was the school board chair and the guy sitting in my chair cost my district $56,000, he'd be looking for a new job. So I panicked. My secretary and I both panicked, actually. The issues ranged from physician referrals, some services that were not documented correctly, missing documentation, unqualified staff, background checks, school closures, and absences. So then we had 30 days to respond. This is my first response. So I had 30 days to come up with 320 pages that referred to the 288 lines of why. I mean, we had to pour through all this paperwork and the service detail reports, look for missing documentation, on top of what I'm doing for kids. And I guess that's the hardest part for us in schools is, we're about providing services for kids, and there is a lot of red tape and especially in special education, a lot of laws. But this just seemed like an excessive amount of work on top of what we were already trying to do to meet kids' needs. That took many phone calls, emails, faxes with the auditor. We were frustrated. Arguably, she was frustrated because we didn't understand each other. When we'd talk about special education law, she really didn't understand that, and we really didn't understand the pressure that Medicaid's under, to be honest, with the audits. And that's kind of the issue with school districts is special IDEA, the Disabilities Act, and Medicaid, they really don't mesh real well the way the system works. So we're trying to always put a round peg in that square hole as school districts. We're not really trying to do it wrong. I mean, we're schools. We're about learning, education. Show us how to do it. Teach us how to do it. We'll do it. We're not making money off Medicaid. As they said earlier, we pay 30% of every service. So we're only getting back the 70%. I'm not out there looking for money, ways to spend 30% more. I get nothing more. I don't get a higher salary if I bill more Medicaid, or nor do my teachers. And so a lot of it is we just don't understand how all that works. So then December 28th, the revised findings came. And the first part of the audit, for us, it was a learning process. We were asking the auditor lots of questions. We came back with a 320-page rebuttal. And then we started seeing things on the letter, and this is a quote: "If medical records do not currently exist in a student's file, they should not be obtained as a result of this review." Maybe I'm paranoid, but we took that we were being told we were manufacturing paperwork. And this is where that June date's kind of important for me. The secretary just happened to catch that, and she ran up and made all these copies. But some of the copies were in another file, like physician referrals, because we keep those in a file to check off, make sure we have them before we bill. Well, some of those didn't get sent. So we did send those in. We didn't go back and get them. We had them all along. But this led us to believe that we were being accused of, we didn't have them in the first place, so we went and made them up. All of a sudden, a staff member showed up that was in question now, that was unqualified. That spreadsheet had almost 1,200 lines. It was so big, we couldn't even print it off. It came on a CD. And so we were asked to go through all 1,200 lines, and it happened to be a contractor, so it was somebody we contracted with. We had to go through all their timesheets and match them with the 1,200 lines. That brought our total to $154,000. We were now talking payback. Well, I about had a heart attack that time. First time I only fell out of my chair. This time I was worried. There was also an issue of where services were provided. You know, we didn't have on a piece of paper that said the kid was going to go on a field trip, or one of our students was on a work study, but they required a psychosocial rehab worker because of their behavior and explosiveness while they were out in the community. But on our IEP, our individualized education plan, we didn't put that, because in our mind, schools are dynamic. School is not a building in our mind in schools. It takes place everywhere. We educate kids all over. But in Medicaid's eyes, school was that building. And so we had a lot of issues around and discussions about what school is. For me, this was another big issue as a school district, is our response was due back January 15th. So we had 1,200 lines to go through and compare all those timesheets. December 28th, we're on Christmas break, so we don't even come back into the office till January 3rd, so now I'm down to 12 days. And so my secretary and myself are the only one in the office. We're doing all this. So in the end, we had a lot of discussions with the auditor. One of them was, what happens if I don't agree with you on these findings? Because a lot of them, we didn't agree. And she explained the process. Arguably, I really didn't understand it. So she sent me a handbook or a place to go look for it. I looked, talked to my superintendent and the board. And really, the process wasn't about if we disagreed with the finding. It was more about if we disagreed with the audit process itself. So that was kind of important to us as we got to the end. And then we got a final letter in March, and it amounted to about $18,000 that we paid back. We talked about going that extra step, applying to see if we could fight for the, because we disagreed. And sometimes we've heard Medicaid go around as a director at these meetings and say, school districts voluntarily paid that back. We disagreed with the $18,000 still. But where it went from 56 to 156 and then back down to 18, and some of it we were contracting with providers and we negotiated with them to pay us back, and our school district share was only about $7,000, we said, let's pay it, right? Let's get out of this thing as fast as we can get, cut our losses and run. So sometimes I think when Medicaid shares that data, I don't want to call it inaccurate, because we did pay it back, but I guess to me it's not an admission of guilt. It was just, let's get out of this thing. That's cheap. You know, if we start trying to pay a lawyer to go through this process, Blaine County tried that. They did refute some of the physician referrals, cost lawyers. My district doesn't have that luxury. You know, and in the end, nothing was said about that employee that we did the 1,200 lines of work on. And I don't know how you guys work, but in a school, you know, kids expect a grade on the work they performed. That just kind of disappeared Really, that's what happened. We didn't submit any more documentation that that employee was qualified now. Nothing different other than we went through that spreadsheet. And that'll become, well, yeah, that'll become important in the last slide. We've had 2 more audits since then, and it was all audits on contracted people out there that provide services for us. Their agency was audited, and they were found to have some issues with either a staff member or their billing, which, as they said earlier, we still assume responsibility for them. We collect all that information from them. I have certificates of their graduation in a binder and all that paperwork that says they're qualified. In this case, the lady had went to a Bible college, and at fault, nobody checked the accreditation. Through the audit, it was not considered an accredited university. So that company had to pay back, which meant since we were responsible, I had to pay back, my district. It was a small enough amount, the company agreed to pay it. In our first audit, we didn't have any of those civil penalties that they mentioned. We just paid back, the money that was found to not be in compliance. In this one, we actually had to pay civil penalties, which, in the school district, we're scratching our head. I get paid to do my job. Why do I have to pay you to do your job? On top of getting fined, I now got to pay you for that. So this was kind of our perspective, and I don't want to be negative because I really do feel like health and welfare in the State Department, as I mentioned earlier, they have really been working hard together. And both IDEA, special education law, and Medicaid, they're very convoluted, compliance-driven. I get that. The audit started out very collaborative. There was a lot of discussion, but it seemed like the further we got into it, the worse it got for us. Terms like fraud were used, getting forms after the fact. That was a quote out of the letter I got from Medicaid, accused of making up documentation. One time the auditor hung up on myself and my secretary because she was frustrated because she couldn't answer the question we were asking. And she just, it's like, I'm done talking to you about this. Well, if I do that in my field, my superintendent's probably going to have a talk with me, because we are a people field. And this is the part I debated whether to leave out or not, but it's my perspective, my school district's perspective. We felt somewhat like there was some scare tactics involved, for a lack of a better way to put it. All right, we started out at 56, we questioned it, we did the work, we did the time to come up with a rebuttal that we thought was legal. The next thing you know, it's a huge amount, and then in the end, it actually becomes a small amount. So, that's probably a poor term, but that's what it felt like, after we were accused of fraud and all these things. So it kind of felt like somewhat, they're going to weaken, they'll pay. And just the amount of the work that it added. I mean, we started in June and finished in March, and that's all we did was Medicaid. I mean, for that year, it seemed like, that school year, on top of all the other things we were having to do. Kind of our final thoughts is we're not making money here for schools. Most of our Medicaid billing is for staff. It's for people. Right? We're not billing for shots and injections and these things. It's for staff. And that relates to needs for kids. Right? These services are needed for kids, and it takes people to provide that. One of the biggest things, we've talked about it, is the amount of paperwork. That brings up another piece of the audit that we wanted to keep, we wanted to go ahead and go after more, and that's what I think our 320 pages shows too, is most of the errors are what we would consider procedural. The kid received the service. We had notes to show that he received the service. We billed for the service, but then in that raft of paperwork and the process, somebody didn't check a box. I mean, they missed one box. And so we weren't allowed to bill for that service, so we had to pay it back. But everything pointed to the physician had referred it, he'd okayed it, he'd signed it, but procedurally we'd missed a box in that raft of paperwork. And remember, it's a teacher doing that. And so she missed it. And then we had to pay back money for that. You know, the process takes away from teaching kids, which we're all about. And paperwork's one of the #1 reasons we can't retain special education staff in the nation, and yet we heap all this on top of them. And districts were caught between a rock and a hard place. I don't want to bill Medicaid. I'm here to tell you, if I didn't have to bill Medicaid because of, one, we have more kids in our schools receiving medical services than we'd ever seen before with all the medical technology. You know, some people would question, is that a school's role? But it is. In special education, we provide those services. But I don't want to bill Medicaid. If I had my way, just give us the money that we need, you know, and we'll go provide the service for the kids. And then to have to go bill Medicaid for that money, it is hard because we don't really want to do it. We don't want to go through the process. We understand the compliance. We understand that in the audit, you know, we could break down and have some mistakes. And none of us out there really want to bill Medicaid for these services. It's just, you know, those services are needed when they cost. A speech therapist cost me about $65 an hour because we can't get one on staff, and there is a chance to bill Medicaid, then we bill. And in our district, and lots of districts, we don't even maximize the billing. Our district could bill for transportation, and we don't even touch that one because there's so much room for error that we don't even want to deal with that. So we leave money out there that we could actually get reimbursed in the schools because the process is so cumbersome, and we are afraid of the compliance. And so if anything was to come out of this and our work with Medicaid and the State Department, I kind of have a wish list, and I talked to some other directors, is really if we could change this into more of an education versus an audit. I mean, schools aren't out there trying to fraudulently do these things. Tell us what to do and we'll do it. Teach us, just like we expect of our kids. You teach me how to do it, I'll do it, right? I just need to know how to do it. I need to know the rules of the game. So continue that process that they've started with the training, but is there a way this could become a preview on a regular basis? I would welcome them to come to my district several times a year, show us how to do it, show us what we're doing so the state's not in danger of paying back money. Teach us, but not a punishment because we didn't do it right for 3 years and then audit me. Teach me all along the way how to do it, and we gratefully do what you ask. There is no negotiated agreement between the State Department of Education and Health and Welfare. This was frustrating for us. If we had a complaint, what do we do? Nobody knew what to do. And other states do have a negotiated agreement between Health and Welfare and the State Department of Ed, and when a school district gets caught in the middle, we have a clear-cut avenue to follow. The thing with the physician referrals, you know, in some states, a practitioner of the healing arts can sign the physician referral. In our state, it takes an actual physician or a nurse or a physician assistant. And in other states, the speech therapist can actually sign the physician referral, which to me makes sense. I'm a speech therapist. I work with a kid every week, a couple times a week. It makes no sense to me that I now send that information to a physician who sees the kid maybe once a year or never, and then he has to okay the service. Why couldn't that practitioner of the healing arts that works with that student, wouldn't it make sense that they're the ones that decide if the kid really needs that service? And that would go the same way for occupational therapy and physical therapy as well. I'm not asking that I get to do it, but let that practitioner of the healing arts do it. And then some states do administrative claiming, which means school districts can actually ask for money back for all the administrative costs. Since the audit, we've hired a half-time person that does nothing but go through Medicaid billing. So 5 days a week, half a day, she goes through every piece of paper. She has checklists she checks. She goes through every service detail to make sure that we're not double billing, to make sure that we're not billing inappropriately. My full-time secretary, she spends 25% to 50% of her time doing the same thing. So the bulk of those two people's work is through Medicaid billing for our school district. we'd like the state to look into administrative claiming to help us recoup some of that. And then in our case, we actually use a service as another set of eyes to check our stuff, that we pay 10% of what we get back for that protection, because we are serious in schools about meeting the law. And so many districts are taking those steps to meet the requirements. And then I'd like us to continue the collaboration for the improvement of services for kids that health and welfare in the state are now doing. We have the same mission, but yet it seems like we've become two separate entities fighting for pockets of money, and Medicaid has to protect the state from having money recouped. I have to protect my school district. If there was some way this could become a real collaborative partnership to actually improve services for kids, because that's both our goals. None of us are bad people, either agency, but how do we do that? I don't know the answers. I just hope that this is the start of coming up with that collaborative partnership. And with that, I once again appreciate you guys' time and inviting me here. And if you have any questions, I'd be honored to try to answer those for you.
Thank you, Mr. Mason. We appreciate your time, too. Questions? Senator Getty?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Mason, thank you for your work. Special education is certainly a huge challenge in the education field, and making even small steps with special education students is very important. So I certainly appreciate that you're here, and I appreciate the wish list that you've provided. At least it gives us a place to look to the department for potential improvement. Mr. Chairman, I guess I have a question, and maybe Mr. Bellamy is the person that should answer this, why we don't have a negotiated agreement between the Department of Education and Health and Welfare in this arena.
Mr. Bellamy, would you like to, for one of your padres, come forward and take a shot at that? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Getty, we don't have a negotiated agreement because the Division of Medicaid reviewed the agreement and felt that it wasn't ready yet. Beyond that, I can't answer. That would be the Division of Medicaid that would have to respond to that. We are not directly involved in the negotiation, just aware of it.
Follow up, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bellamy, then who is directly involved in the negotiation?
That would be the Division of Medicaid. The individual who's responsible for that, I'm not quite sure who the individual is.
Thank you.
Senator Smith, did you have a question?
Yeah,
Go ahead, for Mr. Mason.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for Mr. Mason. And so I appreciate I'm going to echo what Senator Getty said. I appreciate your input, and it's been very informative to me. And just to let you know, your experience going through a Medicaid audit is similar to my experience going through a Medicare audit in terms of the back and forth and how it works. So I don't think it's uncommon. But I'm going to refer you to information that Mr. Bellamy gave us in terms of this graph of the growing costs for Medicaid in school-based services. And I guess I'd like your perspective on why that graph looks like that.
Mr. Mason.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Schmidt, part of it is, a lot of it is with the medical advancements we have these days. We're seeing a lot of kids that might not be in schools 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and they have a lot of medical services that can be provided that allow them to come to schools. And so, that would be an increased billing issue, is because there's more medical services being provided in schools these days. And I was going to bring some pictures of some of the students. These are not the kids that you see walking across the street to school typically. These kids have some real medical needs because it is a medical service, and they're living longer and they're coming to school, and therefore there's an increased billing. I would also say it's the budgets. My special education budget last year through the federal government was cut by $40,000, which is a staff member. We all know school districts' budgets have been cut in the past, and I think schools are trying to bill appropriately for more funds that before we'd leave on the table. If we had that money, we wouldn't be billing for those services. Much like transportation in our case, we revisit it on a yearly basis, and we just leave it alone. But someday, without increased funding, we may have to start billing for that.
Follow up? Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So to follow up on what you were just saying there in terms of, so in my experience with a Medicare audit, they audited and looked for overbilling, but they ignored underbilling. And was that the case in your audit?
Mr. Mason?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Schmidt, I guess if by not pointing it out, they ignored it. They certainly didn't point out that we had underbilled in any way, in which fact most school districts do underbill for the fear of an audit. And also, we tell our staff, if you have to ask yourself if this is billable, no, it's not.
Representative Luker?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mason, you indicated you had to hire a half-time person to do the paperwork, and I've got a two-part question. First is simply, how much is that costing you? And then secondly, having taken that step, are you getting any feedback from Medicaid as to whether you're now in compliance, other than just hoping that you are?
Mr. Mason?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Luker, the cost to hire that person is we're basically paying them a paraprofessional salary in our district. I hate to admit it, that person makes about $12,000 a year plus benefits. So the cost isn't real huge, I guess, in the grand scheme of things. Other than that does take a certain, that same para could also be in a classroom working with kids, and also the level of, it's probably not the level of person that we would need as far as bookkeeping work. She's trying to get trained as fast as she can to do that, where if we were to go out and hire an actual bookkeeper, the cost would increase. And then the billing service that we use to also look at our stuff when we pass on, that costs us 10% of our Medicaid reimbursement rate. And last year that was around $40,000, and that varies with how much billing we do each year. And as far as the feedback from Medicaid, other than the other 2 audits that our contracted providers had went through, we have not heard from Medicaid since. Kind of back to my wish would be come check it out, help me walk through it, do it on a regular basis. Don't wait and make me guess.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just a more global question to maybe follow up on Senator Schmidt's question, and that is, I don't want to or minimize the need for the special education programs, but are those programs that the school districts do because they have taken it on as a part of their mission, or is it something that you've been mandated to do either federally or state wise, if you have an answer to that? And if so, how much of that do you receive funding for? That's kind of a big question. But
Mr. Mason, you'd like to answer that broad question?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Luker, I'll do my best to try. We are mandated by the Individual with Disabilities Act to provide special education services in schools. There is a small window we can get out of that by refusing funding, which we're not going to do, right? So it's a law that we have to follow. The manual itself is about that thick of the regulations. Many of the forms that you saw on the paper come from that law, and then Medicaid has some added forms that they tied into that. And also, you're talking to a person that's involved in special education, so although it's a law, it's also a moral dilemma, and for many of us, and myself especially, is these kids do belong in school. We do have a moral right to provide these services, whether it's funded or not. And many of us in special education would agree that we should provide them even if it didn't come with funding. In my school district, I get funded. This year it was $588,000 through the Individual with Disabilities Act. That's the amount of money my school district gets. We also have to provide out of our general fund a match of those kids as well. And that's going to be roughly another 600,000, so we're over $1 million. Plus, if you threw in, what we're getting reimbursed for Medicaid, it would even be larger. I think that's the best I can do on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Mason. That's a good stab at that. There are a lot of services available, obviously, that you provide, PSR, speech therapy, and probably things that, a lot of us here don't even realize. But are those specifically mandated under the Disabilities Act, or are they just things that you have to do to comply, if you understand what I'm saying?
Mr. Mason?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Luker. That's interesting you say that, because that goes back to that round hole square peg thing that I talked about earlier. Is IDEA does not specifically list some of these services in Medicaid, like psychosocial rehab. I mean, we're supposed to, through IDEA, the Individuals with Disability Act, we're supposed to provide services for kids in special education. And their term is related services. They do spell out things like speech therapy, occupational therapy, but any of the related services could be psychosocial rehab, it could be counseling, anything else that would relate to the service that kid needs. So oftentimes we're writing those individualized education plans, which they get monitored. We get monitored from the state on our special ed piece too. So not only do we get monitored by Medicaid over here, but we also get monitored by the special education paperwork as well. That sheet that I handed out earlier last year, I sent a letter to Mr. Luna, Mr. Henderson with the State Department of Education, and Mr. Winslow at the Administrators Association, and attached 80 pages of IDEA Medicaid documentation that would take to do that. So those services really aren't specifically spelled out in IDEA law, and that's why it doesn't work very well when we try to write an individualized education plan through IDEA. Sometimes it doesn't match Medicaid, so we're kind of always on that border of breaking one or the other law, and it's really hard to juggle that because they really don't marry very well.
Senator Cameron.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Mason, thank you for being here with us. I have to admire your demeanor and your courage at the same time for being here. I know when the co-chair and I were trying to set the agenda, we wanted a little bit of a response to what we were hearing from the department. And there were several individuals we talked to that weren't so eager to come and talk to us. For a number of reasons, but one of them obviously is because it's a sensitive subject, and some of them are still going through audits. I want to request, if you would, a copy of your slides, if you'd provide that to Sharmi either electronically, and then she can get it to us, if that's okay with you.
Yes, sir.
You talked a lot about the paperwork necessary. Do you have an idea about how much of that paperwork is federally required versus how much of it is additive from the state?
Go ahead, Mr. Mason, sorry.
Mr. Chairman, Chairman Cameron, I guess off the top of my head that'd be tough for me to answer, but the bulk of that paperwork is IDEA mandated through the Idaho Special Education, the manual. A lot of that paperwork is. But Medicaid is piggybacking on that in that we have to fill that paperwork out in order to bill Medicaid. The student must be eligible, they must have an individualized education plan. So that paperwork needs to be filled out. That's where we delineate what service the student will get, whether it's psychosocial rehab, speech and language, occupational therapy. So that stuff all goes on those federally mandated forms through special education law. And then Medicaid just has a few, not a few, but some more forms to piggyback on. But most of that paperwork is mandated by IDEA that we have to do anyway. The issue becomes the penalty and missing, for us, and the process for us. As you see, the process is very convoluted, if you will.
And Mr. Chairman, I'll shift from that to ask one more process question. Certainly, as was said before, your wish list certainly gives us a place to start, but it's not necessarily the end. You talked about what happens if you disagree, what at any time was there portrayed to you other than going to court? Was there any time was there a discussion about an appeals process, some sort of mechanism for which that you could be heard for your side of the situation?
Mr. Mason?
Chairman Collins, Chairman Cameron. Yes and no. I mean, that's what we really didn't understand when we asked, what do we do next? We were cited, go to IDAPA here, and I have to apologize. It's been several years since we went through the audit. But the gist, so I don't know exactly what it says, but the gist of it was we could really only address the audit process itself. And in fact, one time in our discussion with the auditor, it's like, what do we do if we don't agree with you? Who do we go talk to? Who's your boss? And we were told she made the ultimate decision. And we didn't know what to do next, I mean, honestly. So that's the best I can answer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Haggerty?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mason, first, thank you, number one, for what you do. Thank you for coming before us. We're just like you. We come from all walks of life. Yesterday I was wearing my jeans, and today I'm wearing this. So I appreciate you standing up and telling us your side of the story. One of the things I think struck me that you said is we really are not trying to do it wrong. And I think we're all there. I think we're all trying to do the same thing. Unfortunately, looking at the list of all the documents that you do have to do, mistakes are going to happen. I can just see that. I'm wondering, is the individual education plan for the students that I'm assuming you write or someone on your staff writes, is that approved by both health and welfare for Medicaid purposes and the services needed and the State Department of Education?
Mr. Mason?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hagedorn, I believe so. I mean, I'm not involved with Medicaid intricately, but that's what we're told. If we fill out that IDEA paperwork and then those extra forms with Medicaid, yes, that's what we're supposed to do. If I'm understanding the question, I mean, could I get a little more clarification if I'm not answering it?
Follow up, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Well, I think the fact that you're not sure is very telling to me. But we are sure that you're being audited for the Medicaid submissions that you put in for that particular individual. Mm-hmm. So that tells me we've got a bit of a broken process there. If Billy Bob Grab-A-Sandwich gets speech therapy, that should be approved in a Medicaid individual education plan. And so I would think there wouldn't be many questions about whether or not that would be appropriate to bill that. I can understand that questions could happen whether the speech therapist would be qualified, whether it was double billed, those types of things. Those would be good practices. But I have concerns that we don't have a synergistic process between a Department of Health and Welfare and a Department of Education, making sure that everybody is on the same page. I think your comments about having a collaborative process, an annual review, I think is also very important, but that is going to cost us funds to do that. So we've got to figure out, and I'd like your suggestions, besides having someone come to your school district, because there's 114 of them, every month or every quarter or whatever that is, what do you think would be the best minimal way to educate you and your staff to make sure you're doing the right things?
Mr. Mason?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hagedorn, I think I have a little more to add to your first question. I don't write the individual education plan. That happens with a team of folks out in the school. So it includes a general ed teacher, the principal, the special education teacher, the therapist. So this team sits down at the grassroots level down there at the school, and they make decisions based on what the kid needs. Has nothing to do with Medicaid, right? That's what we're required to do through special education. So then we complete that individualized education plan, and they may or may not know that the kid even has a medical card. There is no discussion in that room about how the funding comes. It's what the kid needs, and they develop that plan for that kid. Then it comes to our office, and we're, oh, this student has a medical card, and then we go through that process. So the decisions being made on that individualized education plan are made about the kid by the people that best know the kid. And so that's who's making those decisions. And then as far as the review piece, I can only talk about how I live in the special education world, but the State Department of Education, they periodically review files. They ask for a small percentage every year, and they do it in a collaborative teaching way, and they ask me to fix that. Right? They say, within the year, would you please fix these files? And then I also submit some more sometimes if they have questions, if there's concerns. And I guess in my mind, if at minimal, we would be asked for a small percentage of files each year or bi-yearly or however. But then when they're looked at, not to punish me, but to show me, teach me, what to do. And if you want me to pass the test, you got to show me, you got to teach me what I need to know to be able to pass the test.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
You made a comment that it was years ago when your school district was audited. Could you tell me how long ago that was, and if you've seen practices change since that audit happened?
Real quick. Oh, Mr. Chairman, Senator Hagedorn. It was 2000. It wasn't years ago. It was 2012 when we first got the audit. So it was just a couple years ago. Sorry. And as far as the practices changed, according to other directors, this is probably more hearsay. It doesn't sound like it. In fact, with the new procedures that you heard about, the term I hear out there from directors is now Medicaid has a hired gun. They get paid by finding things, right? I believe it was 10% the company gets, if you find infractions. Well, the chair I sit in, I can tell you if you paid me if I found out how many times you were wrong, I could dig awful deep and I could find a lot of errors if that's how my bill is getting paid. And as a special ed director group, that's scary to us that that's not collaborative. And so as far as the practices changing, I can't really say personally, have I seen it, but I'm saying no. In fact, it might have gotten worse if we're going to, and this isn't my term, but that's the term I've heard used, is a hired gun.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Vick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question in regards to the auditor. Was the auditor that you had a state, federal, or a contract auditor? Do you know? Were they a state employee, a federal employee, or were they on contract?
Mr. Mason.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Vick, I believe they were a state employee. It wasn't the the company that's going around with the new audits where they get paid by finding informations. But it was a state person at a state office that I called, so that leads me to believe it was a state employee.
Okay, and that,
Follow up?
yeah, thank you. Just want to express the concern that Mr. Mason has already expressed, that if you pay these auditors based on what they find, I just think that's a real can of worms. I don't know how many of us have been audited by the IRS, but I have. And if they got paid based on how much they found wrong, that is really messed up, in my opinion. And so I just wanted to express that. And if it was a state employee, I'm a little disappointed in how they handled, from your perspective anyway. It sounds like they didn't handle things very well. And so I just want to express those concerns, and thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mason, did you ever request training for yourself or your staff related to Medicaid billing?
Mr. Mason?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Tippett, when I first became a special education director, many directors did, and we never received any. I mean, we always get referred back to IDAPA, and I can tell you, just like with special education, interpretation of those rules are different for different people. And I guess that's what we're looking for, is tell us what the interpretation is. So the answer is, I'm not aware of any. Now, school districts, a few years ago, Meridian, there are people that, which they're one of the largest districts in the state and bill Medicaid. The school district themselves had a training and was gracious enough to invite all of us in on that training. Some of the things that have changed, though, is this year there has been training with Shannon Dunstance in Health and Welfare, so we are seeing a change in that. There are some trainings posted on the Idaho Training Clearinghouse for us, so that piece has changed a little. Is it enough? Probably not.
Mr. Chairman, a follow-up.
Go ahead.
So, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Mason, you mentioned that when you first became a director, there was request along with other directors for training, and that wasn't received. To whom did you make that request? And then another question is, have you taken advantage of the more recent educational opportunities that you mentioned have become available?
Mr. Mason?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Tippett, that's an interesting question because, is it Mr. Bellamy? I'm sorry, like Mr. Bellamy said, I don't really even know. There's so many different agencies and people involved in Medicaid. That's one of the issues back then. We're getting it narrowed down, is we didn't know who to talk to at Medicaid. So when you say, who did you ask? We would ask our regional coordinator in Twin Falls. That was our first. That's what we thought. And they're like, we're not aware of anything like that. And then when you would ask the department, it's like nobody knew. We didn't have, like when I work with special education law, I know who to go deal with. If I need help with the budget, I know who to call, the State Department of Ed. And so part of our problem was we didn't know who to contact to ask for the training. So we really didn't know who we were asking to. And now that's gotten a little better. And yes, many school districts have accessed the training. They did on-site training around the state. I can't really speak for the numbers, but I know there were over 50 people there. We even had our teachers come so they could understand what we're asking them to do. So yes, and then on the Idaho Training Clearinghouse, there are some webinars and forums, and we use those in many of our own trainings. But it would really be nice, like I say with the State Department of Ed, it's nice to hear it from the horse's mouth so there's no interpretation. By the time I get it and then I go back to my staff, it may not be as accurate.
Representative Smith?
Thank you. Mr. Mason, I know in the school district in my area, we hired a Medicaid billing person. It was around 2000. When I was still employed in the school district. And I'm wondering if there are now school districts similar to your size of Jerome. Are you statewide? Do you know of more school districts that are hiring persons to do Medicaid billing?
Mr. Mason?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Smith, almost every school district that bills Medicaid either has to hire somebody specifically for that purpose, or it takes away from the portion of somebody's job, like a secretary. For instance, a Wendell, I know they don't specifically hire a person to do that, but it consumes their special education secretary, part of her day to bill Medicaid. Most of the districts our size or bigger are paying people. I can speak for Twin Falls. They have one full-time person. That's all they do. They used to use another agency also on top of that, and budget issues, because we pay those other agencies. They elected to not do that this year. And I know the director personally, and one of the concerns is that's a level of protection we had, and now we gave it up, due to budget issues.
Follow-up?
Go ahead.
I noticed that you mentioned in your testimony today about how the new procedures and requirements are, shall we say, constantly changing. Is there some yearly training that the State Department of Ed could be offering to help the people that are working with the Medicaid billing, or is it just kind of haphazard at this time?
Mr. Mason?
Chairman and Representative Smith, it's better. I mean, like this year was the best year for me ever. I mean, that training was very enlightening, and I do have to speak to the courage of Shannon Dunstan and the other lady from Medicaid who stood in a room of schools that have been through audits and were scared and running, and they did a great job, and it was collaborative. It was my wish list. It just barely happened, though, this year, and it's just starting, and my fear is that it would go back to being haphazard and us just trying to make that way up. Medicaid has done a nice job. They do now have a school-based Medicaid site. You can get updates and stuff. But again, it's when I read that versus the people that wrote that, an interpretation of an auditor, that kind of all breaks down in the process. And to me, that's back to that collaborative model. I can speak to special education. You can put every director in the State Department of Education, the director, Richard Henderson, and all his staff in a room, and somebody can ask a question, and the 100 of us in the room will answer it 100 different ways. And that's kind of the case with Medicaid, back to that collaborativeness. Can show us how to do it, and we'll do it.
Thank you, and good luck in the future.
Thank you.
Representative Hickson.
Thank you, Chairman Collins. And Mr. Mason, thank you for your presentation today. I certainly have taken away a lot of good information on this. One question I have for you, out of all the areas you spoke about, I guess one of the things that really stands out in my mind are the mountains of paperwork you've had to do with this process, and also all the files you have to keep there at the district level to make that happen. My question is, what in your opinion, Mr. Mason, is there some sort of a technology component that may reduce your personnel cost and kind of what we're trying to do here at the state level and the overall complexity of this process? I mean, we're in 2013 and we're still filling out, 13,000 pages for this. So in your opinion, is there something we can do to make that a little easier for you guys and the state?
Mr. Mason.
Chairman and Representative Hickson, there's plenty of software you can buy, like through this billing service we use. They have a product, and when we looked at it, it really didn't fit our needs, and many of the school districts are finding that it doesn't, because when I'm working with a student, I don't always have that device on me, and I have to be able to keep track. I mean, the mountain of paperwork, I really like the way you said that, because I wrote a letter to Mr. Luna, Rich Henderson, and the association last year, and that's kind of what I said. This is more like racing to the top of Mount Bora of paperwork than actually racing to the top of meeting kids' needs. But back to your question, sorry for the bird walk. But, they have to keep such close track, because some of these services we bill in 15-minute increments. Like I might be working with a student, he doesn't need me for an hour, and then all of a sudden I'm providing the service. Well, they need to be able to write down when they provided the exact times, and then notes as to what that service looked like. And I guess if we could give them all one-to-one devices and they could have that stuff right there, technology might work. But that's kind of the flaw in the technology, is if I tell you to put it on paper and then I want you to, this is why we didn't go with the technology system to our billing services. I'm going to ask my staff to now put it on paper, and then at the end of the day, I want you to go over to a computer system and enter it in. And in our district, we felt like that was asking too much of teachers. There's already enough work to do. We'll just deal with the paperwork. We could enter that in at our level, but it would take probably that half-time person I currently have to make that a full-time position, and then all she did was enter that information.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
What, in your opinion, could the state do better when it came to the technology portion? Is there some sort of an online aspect that you could get onto instead of, again, having to send, this Mount Bora of paperwork to these guys?
Mr. Mason.
Chairman Collins, Representative Hickson, I mean, I suppose there is, but it still goes back to the people at the grassroots level. They're doing the work. Are they going to pull up their one-to-one device all of a sudden when I provide that service? Many of them just carry clipboards around because that's easier for them than, I got to go pull up an app. And if you're providing something like psychosocial rehab or intensive behavior intervention, you may be providing that service for several hours at a time if the student's having a real behavioral issue. I guess there could be, but that's been our struggle, is what do I do at the grassroots level while I'm working with the kid? The best way to have it fresh in my mind, because we know Medicaid's going to look at these notes. So if I ask you to wait till the end of the day and try to remember what happened at 8 o'clock, that's not fair to my employee, me to the district, or even to Medicaid, because I'm not going to be able to meet their standards. So I guess that's a long answer to, I'd love to see it, but I'm just not sure how that would work.
Thank you, Mr. Mason.
Senator Getty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for the education of the committee, when DEA was passed by Congress, they promised us 40% of our costs. They've averaged about 7%.
Thank you, Senator. Any further questions for Mr. Mason? Mr. Mason, we really appreciate your time. You've been grilled pretty well here, and you're well prepared. And we appreciate, again, the task that you have to do, and all the other people in the school districts that do. And we do appreciate the job, because it is a hard task. But thank you for coming.
Thank you, and thanks for your time.